have got board meetings. I know people have got children like me that they've shaken off and put in another part of the house, hoping they won't interrupt. I know that there's a lot going on, so thank you ever so much. And yeah, just want to really say that I know when we've been talking to some of you, you've been very busy, but you've allowed us a bit of time, so thanks very much. So what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about a new piece of research called the Community Research Index that we've kicked off. And John, our interim CEO, is here and is going to do the meat of the meeting. But one of the things I wanted to say in kind of starting us off is just say a little bit about why we've done that. I'm Director of Engagement and Insight at the fund. My name's Pfizer, for those of you that don't know me. And when I came into post just over a year ago, one of the things I was really keen to do is up our insight, listening, sharing, intelligence work. So we're a large funder, 14,000 grants a year. We have a lot of insight, intelligence and knowledge that comes from that. I think for me, one of the key things is how are we using that to be accessible, more digestible in our learning? And this index is part of that, but it's not the only piece of that work. So there's lots on our site that you can look at that we've been doing, particularly in the last year since COVID hit, to make sense of the experience for communities. I think what makes this different is it is a research index that isn't necessarily our grant holders' views, it's the views of people out there. And I'm not going to steal John's thunder because John's going to go into that much more. But we've got an illustrious group of people here, really pleased that we've got a really wide range of people from all parts of the UK. It's a UK Community Research Index. And without rabbiting on, which I'm guilty of doing in most occasions, I'm going to hand over to John. And then there's some topics that we're going to discuss as we go through. And one last thing I just wanted to say, sorry, I forgot all the housekeeping rules I've been told to say, which are please mute if you can to keep the background noise out. Use the chat function if you would like to raise a question or put your hand up. And we are recording the session. Thanks for those of you that sent back concept forms. And we would like to share some of the conversations. So do hashtag on Twitter. And I'm told it is TNLcom with 2 M's fund event. And hashtag CRI to share some of the thoughts. The full report and its findings will be published in early March, as we're just developing some stories from the questions that we've been asking people. And so that is the timeline for a full report to be out. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Pfizer. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure, actually, both to see on my small screen a few familiar faces, but also some new faces. So my name's John Rose. As Pfizer's just mentioned, I'm the interim Chief Executive for National Lottery Community Fund. But those of you who do know me will know that I've been around for rather a long time in one guise or another. So my day job is the Wales Director, which I do substantively, and I've stepped into this role while we recruit a permanent Chief Executive. So looking forward to that and really enjoying the fact that I'm getting to meet people from beyond the national borders of Wales anyway. So looking forward to today. So I think it goes without saying that the last 12 months has been like no other I've ever experienced, or I hope anyone else has ever experienced. We knew very early on that the best thing that we could do as a fund was to provide flexible support to community groups and charities so that they could respond and support the communities we all serve. We did this by showing flexibility in the use of our national lottery funding, and where possible, minimising the administrative burden and getting money out the door quickly to where it was needed. In the last 10 months alone, just to give you a sense of scale, we've committed in excess of £550 million of both national lottery and government funding. And across the UK, we've actually paid out over £860 million. So we've really accelerated many of the commitments that we've made up front. But we know that this is we're just one part of a much bigger effort, and that many of you have been in the front line and supporting your communities through the pandemic as we emerge from it. And, I'd just like to say a big thanks for that, because it's the work that you guys do that literally saves lives. Our role is to support that with some finance, but I know that a lot of people are very much on the front line and experiencing that in a far more acute manner than we do. So all this has been against the backdrop of some very big societal issues as well. So structural inequalities, in particular in health and education, and some shocking differences between the experience of different communities laid bare. And I think importantly, a real heightened public awareness of this. We know there are many challenges exacerbated by the pandemic, with concerns over mental health, loneliness and isolation, and longer-term existential challenges like climate change, which still feature large in people's minds. We're really excited about the role that we can play to support communities to adapt and emerge from the pandemic, building on some of the work that feels like it's accelerated during the crisis, such as closer work partnership working, greater power sharing, and building on the commitments we've already made to improve and ensure that we're open to and receptive to all communities, reinforcing the fact that our national lottery funding is for everyone. We're also conscious that we're in a privileged position and able to communicate not only with stakeholders like yourselves, but with government about emerging needs. And that's why we've continued to talk and listen to communities throughout the pandemic and going on into events like this one today. So it seemed to us a really opportune time to create and launch our new Community Research Index, tapping into the hearts and minds of people and communities across the UK, including those that we serve, lottery ticket players, and getting a real sense of what's important to the public. And this will help understand their hopes and worries as they endure the pandemic. So our newly launched Community Research Index is an annual survey of over 7,000 adults across the UK. It's designed to get a temperature check on how people are feeling about their communities and their key concerns for the year ahead. We want to use the index to test and enhance learning gleaned from thousands of projects and groups that we fund every year and all the stakeholder engagement we do as well. We'll use it as an annual exercise and to inform our grant making and also help it to hold a mirror up to ourselves to look about how we can improve. And more importantly, we want to share the learnings with the wider sector, policymakers and government through a range of communication and events like these. So we're here today very much to listen and hear your thoughts on our findings, on the actual research and anything else you'd like to feed back to us today. So we're going to have a few questions shortly when I pass back to Pfizer, but please feel free and do offer thoughts as we go through that. We're also happy to share the data and the report prepared by the independent researchers, and do let us know afterwards if you'd like these. But as Pfizer mentioned, it should be available in early March. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the key findings, and many of you may have seen these through the press release that we've issued before. So what we found that was actually across the UK, almost 7 in 10 people feel that they're part of their local community, with around a third acknowledging that COVID has increased their sense of belonging and also made it more important for them to feel a part of it. Indeed, 3 in 10 say that they plan to get more involved in their local community in 2021. So despite all the difficulties and the appalling things that have happened during the pandemic, this sense of community seems to be shining through. Reduce loneliness and isolation, helping the local community and local economy, supporting mental health and helping local people live healthily and well all seem to be important according to the survey's results. Other 2021 priorities are access to natural green spaces, providing young people with places to go and activities to do, and community activities that bring people together, all of which could potentially help. And another concern that communities have, and that's the one about safety on their streets, of which 54% said they had concerns. What we're really pleased about is we can see parallels with our funding over the last year or so. So during that time, we've funded in excess of 3,500 projects which specifically tackle loneliness and isolation, a very similar number that support young people, and over 1,200 projects that benefit the environment by improving local place. The majority of these projects not only deliver those outcomes, but serve in one guise or another to bring people together and help improve lives. So that's very much a headline of some of what we've found through the survey. It gives you a flavour of what we've heard, and what we'd like now is to go into a number of questions, but please, as Pfizer mentioned, use the chat function. We do have some prompt questions, but we're very interested in hearing your take of your experience of recent months, but also your thoughts on going forward. So thanks very much. Looking forward to listening to you this morning. We're very much on listening mode, and I'll pass back to Pfizer.
Thank you, John. That was a really great run through of some of the key findings. And as John said, we've got 3 topics for discussion for us to delve a bit deeper. And So I'm just going to go straight into it. I would say again, also the hashtag on Twitter, if you want to share some of your thoughts, hashtag CRI and hashtag TNL Fund event. In terms of topic 1 that we've got queued up, it's that top finding really of 7 in 10 people saying that they feel like they are part of their local community, and over a third saying that COVID has made them feel even more so. We'd like to understand your experience. We're so lucky to have so many of you from different parts of the UK and different kind of perspectives. And what this part of the conversation is to hear what you're seeing, to see what you're seeing and hear what you're hearing, and see if that rings true with some of the things that we're thinking about from the findings. To kick us off, I've asked Carol Mack to offer some thoughts, not least because Carol is CEO of the Association of Charitable Foundations, and in being so is in a wonderful position to hear lots and lots of perspectives from lots of funders, not just us. And it would be interesting to hear, Carol, whether or not what we're finding from the survey is some of what you've been also hearing, and any of the, I suppose, deeper insights also from your work on the Funders Collaborative Hub as well, in terms of the impact of COVID on communities. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Faiza, and thank you, John. It's hardly surprising, really, the finding that we all feel more connected to our communities, because for much of the past 12 months, we haven't been able to leave our communities. So it's great that, in a way, that's prompted people to want to get to be more involved and to discover what it means to be living in a particular place, to be from somewhere. ACF members are very broad in their funding. You know, we have science funders, education funders, and they funded a range, as well as the charity sector and community issues. And foundations operate at a range of levels, internationally, nationally, regionally, and locally. And very early in foundation development, many centuries ago, foundations were often established to be very embedded in a community. They were often set up to benefit a parish or a town. And it's interesting that certainly in the last century, in a way, that's been rediscovered with the growth of community foundations. And now everywhere in the UK will have a foundation focused on a particular community as defined at county level or national level in the case of Scotland and Wales. More recently, foundations have tended to focus on particular themes, on particular issues, as well as communities. But increasingly, certainly over the last 10 years, those issue-based foundations have increasingly been taking a place-based approach. There's been a sense that if you just parachute in and expect your work to be impactful, you may be disappointed, and that everything operates within a place, and you need to take time to understand that particular community if you want your work to be effective. So I would say foundations take a direct interest in communities, but they may be defining that in different ways. Sometimes it will be a geographical community. Other times they may be thinking of community in terms of the field within which they operate, or the issues or communities of practice that they seek to support. I suppose the other thing I would say that particularly since COVID, foundations have become more aware of themselves as a community, and that instead of just focusing on their individual efforts, they need to understand how what they're doing relates to what other funders are doing, and how together they can be more than the sum of their parts. So I'm seeing growing interest in collaboration between funders. And also I'm seeing funders, John touched and Faiza touched on the issues of power and about who makes decisions. And I'm seeing many foundations thinking about how they can give communities a greater role in governance and in decision making. In some cases, that's looking at board level involvement. In other cases, it's looking at participatory grant making and devolved decision making. As John mentioned, the impact of COVID forced many foundations that often operate in the long term to think about the short term and the emergency. And the emergency response in relation to COVID was very often focused on communities. And in terms of COVID, in a way, almost all foundation work this year will take COVID into account. Not all foundations are focused on the emergency, and rightly so. There are many charities that want to be around in the long term, and we want them to be around in the long term. But in a way, everything that you fund at the moment will be funded with a COVID lens, because COVID has been so all-consuming that it's impacted on every aspect of society you can think about. And in the early days of the COVID emergency, the word on everyone's lips was recovery, whereas now what I'm hearing people talk about is adaptation, that there's less of a sense that we're going to go through this sharp acute crisis and bounce back, but that people are starting to think about how we can, to use the phrase, build back better. So just some observations from the foundation community, and really interested to hear from you all today, particularly those of you operating on the front line with very direct experience of the issues I've been talking about.
Thank you so much, Carol. And indeed, you gave over your conference at the end of last year to talk about that renewal and adaptability. So just thanks so much for everything ACF is doing to try and help make sense of this for all of us funders and communities that we serve. Got some hands up, and it's brilliant because I said I'd open the floor, and I was hoping people would contribute. Might be questions for Carol or your perspective on the topic itself. So I think I've got Sarah Mann and two others. Now the problem is I can't see all of the hands. I've got Lindsay, Sarah, and there might be others coming up as names at the bottom. And if you are one of the others, could you pop your name in the chat? Paul Roberts as well. So let's go Lindsay, Sarah, Paul. And if I've missed you out, please pop your name in the chat. And we've also got a question from David. I'll come back to that in a moment when I've just had a chance to read it. Lindsay, go on.
Morning, everybody. I'm Lindsay from the Eden Project, and our kind of flagship programme, for those that don't know, is the Big Lunch, which is the UK's annual kind of Thanksgiving celebration weekend for neighbours and communities, which happens on the first weekend in June every year. And we work with communities all year round. And one of the things that we've noticed in our research in this past year, so we do an annual survey of around 4,000 people, UK representative, is also an increased sense of belonging this year compared to last. So obviously this is your first capturing of belonging, and our figures are very similar to yours. But we saw a 5% increase in 2020 on 2019 for both neighbourhood belonging and also UK belonging, so belonging to the sense of the country. So that'd be interesting to see how that evolves in coming years. And the other thing I wanted to sort of touch on that's come through in our belonging research is that it's affected quite heavily by things like whether you've got access to outside space. So that's has a negative effect if you don't have access to a garden, and equally a positive sense of belonging is achieved by those people who are more active in their local society. And that's quite interesting in that I think the sense of belonging in our research seems to affect the likelihood of you being active in community events like the Big Lunch. So we see belonging both at neighbourhood level and at national level much, much higher in those people who participate in an event like that, a community focused event. And so that's quite interesting in terms of if we can foster that sense of belonging across the UK and in our communities, we are more likely to see people being able to step forward and take part in community activity and volunteering. So it's really interesting to see if COVID starts that trend. And I think we've already seen the sort of ups and downs that might have in terms of whether people are sustaining, I suppose, the community action that we saw rise up in that first wave. But it'd be really interesting to see how that compares with other people's experience of this past year.
Thanks, Lindsay. I've got lots of hands, and thanks very much for that tip from one of our guests about the participants list. That's going to change my life, actually. So I've got, going down the list of hands, there are a lot. So let's try and, if I can ask people to also introduce themselves, please, that would be great. So Sarah Mann, and then I've got Paul Roberts, Tony Armstrong, Jacob, Darren, goodness me, Pat, Sado and Chanel. So if you can kind of remember where you are, and I'll do another recap in a sec. And then I think we move on to topic 2 after that.
Lovely, thank you. I'm Sarah Mann, I'm Director for Friends, Families and Travellers, a national Gypsy, Roma and Traveller charity. I'm interested in terms of the 7,000 that you surveyed, how representative that was of different communities across the UK. So with Gypsies and Travellers at 1 in 200 of the population, that would make 35 Gypsies and Travellers included in that survey, and I'm interested to know, one, if that was the case, And then 2, if there were differences in feelings of inclusion or connectedness for different groups within the survey block. So whether gypsies and travellers felt more included, less included. And I have an agenda there because our experience in supporting families across the UK during COVID is that it sharpened some of those feelings of either connectedness or disconnectedness. And in fact, you know, we saw cases of people either being blamed, evicted, a couple of cases of traveller sites being locked up, so security on the gate, so people couldn't leave for any reason. There's a recent one in Flintshire actually where that was the case, and so I'm very interested in the difference between communities across the UK and their differences in feelings of connectedness.
Right, I'm going to come back on that one. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer all the questions, and indeed we want to hear from you. So thanks for saying a bit about your experience. It was politically and representatively weighted amongst all adults in the UK. So 7,000 people participated, and that was geographically spread. Now, whether or not we know exactly the kind of level of that detail around did they come from a Gypsy traveller community, I actually am not sure. But we used opinion precisely because we wanted an independent researcher who is very expert at this sort of stuff, and I am sure may be able to help us find out the answer to your question. The other thing I would say, Sarah, is one of the things that we've been doing through the Insights function that I head up is sharing experiences from particular communities, because actually people get lost in these big surveys, don't they? And experience gets lost. So maybe we can pick up with you later around helping to amplify some of the things that you're hearing through our Voices from the Pandemic series, which might be an interesting thing for you to share. Okay, I'm conscious of time. We've got 2 other topics as well. So Paul Roberts, you're next on our list of hands.
I'll be brief. I'm Paul Roberts. I'm the Chief Exec of LGBT Plus Consortium. We're the umbrella body for LGBT VCOs across the UK. So I was really pleased to hear Carol mention that the definition of what we perceive to be community, and that it's not just about physical communities, place-based communities. Particularly for our communities, it's less tangible much of the time, and there tends to be smaller concentrations, particularly in those more rural areas. And people travel vast distances to get together with people from their own communities, and that sense of community has almost created a further divide, particularly with when it comes to digital poverty. In that, interestingly, both for older LGBT plus people and younger LGBT plus people, initially during the first lockdown, people were beginning to take to that connection through digital means, and using that as building that new sense of community. But over the year, that's shrunk, and even younger people who, technology savvy, have really struggled connecting through those digital means and want that physical space. But where they're traveling, some of them would travel 50 miles to go to an LGBT youth group in the past. They suddenly can't do that. So it's just that acknowledgement that communities and how we define them aren't always that place-based, but non-geographical communities are really important. It's just something we need to consider.
Thank you. That's brilliant, Paul. Got a very busy chat function going. I'm going to keep moving us on, and as I said, the team will be in touch to pick some of this up. We've got more media coming out about the findings in early March, so we may come back to you on some of these points. Thanks. Tony.
Hi, Tony Armstrong, Chief Exec of Locality.
I haven't seen you in a long time. Hello.
Hiya. So we've done quite a lot of research on this as well, looking at how communities have responded during the crisis. We did some research particularly over the summer last year, and then around our member experiences in late autumn as well. And I think it would chime roughly with some of the statistics that you found in terms of people feeling more connected or engaged in their local community, although we were particularly interested in thinking about how we turned that community spirit, which is been coming out in different communities. I would say it is variable, though. It isn't the same picture in every single place, and there are clearly, as Paul was saying, differences between communities of place and other communities. But I think what we were interested in was how we turned that into community spirit, into community power. And so thinking about the impact of social infrastructure and institutions at a local level that are able to harness that community spirit in a meaningful way. And what we found in our research was that the picture was very variable. In some areas with good local capability and capacity, a good network of local institutions like community organisations and other VCSE organisations, they were able to respond quickly, they were able to galvanise volunteers, they were able to use their existing relationships in a really positive way to link with public sector and other groups locally. But where you didn't have that, actually it was very hard to try and tap into people's need or desire to want to get involved in it. So I think it's great that we've had this moment, and I think the thing for us is like we have a possibility to try and tap into that interest and that upswing, particularly as people are more engaged in what's going on in their local areas. But I think there has been a big gap in terms of the things that would help sustain that interest and then turn that interest into something which is much more sustainable and long lasting.
Thank you, Tony. That's really helpful. Jacob, Darren and Pat. And then I'm conscious some of the most patient people were the ones with their hands up first, but I switched how I was coming around to you, so I apologise. Jacob, Darren and Pat, and then we've got Sado, Lindsay and Chanel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jacob. I'm Head of Strategy and Insight at Mind, the mental health charity. Really welcome this research. Thanks very much, and looking forward to seeing more of the detail. I think building on Sarah and Paul's points, I think it's really interesting to explore who doesn't feel that they belong, and particularly when looking at this at an individual as well as a area basis. So if you live in a very close-knit community, but you feel like an outsider within it, a kind of geographic measure of belonging actually could reinforce your sense of isolation. So I think that's really interesting to explore. And I'd really encourage us to think, when we're thinking about social connection and social capital, about bonding and bridging. So bonding being bringing together people who are already like one another and making them feel more connected. Bridging, bringing together people who are different. And what we know about really healthy and mentally healthy communities is that both of those are really important. But actually in this pandemic, where we've seen a real entrenching of inequalities, there's a real sense that we may be increasing the bonding amongst people who are already similar, but actually losing those opportunities for the bridging, because we miss the spaces for people to come together serendipitously or kind of bump into one another. And when we are having to distance, you don't want to lose those opportunities to connect to people who were different. And I think that's going to be really important priority for a recovery.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's really helpful. Darren, I think, was next.
Yes, good morning. I'm Darren Marinas, Chief Executive Expert at Citizens. We sort of agree, and the same experience is really what's happening in our community. What we've really seen is Lex-led organisations, young, small, community, grassroots, lived experience-led organisations really come into their own during the pandemic from the very start, from last March, and still going and working 24/7. Where some of the main bigger providers may have took that little bit more time to adapt to the situation. Our concern is sustaining these groups after and really looking after them as they've looked after the communities. But also what we've seen is like some of the other guys have said this morning, that massive digital divide. So when we talk about connectivity and loneliness, that actually a lot of people we work with who go to physical groups for support them with their addiction. A lot of that stuff has moved online, but some of these people don't have the technology, they don't have the skills, and certainly don't have the data. But as we push more and more people, and especially people who we sometimes class as vulnerable into this digital space, we're often forgetting about that digital safeguarding these people will need as well, as we've seen more and more increased online digital scams targeted at some of the people, some of the most vulnerable in our communities. So that is, and that also leads into loneliness, as well as some of these people are used to going to physical spaces for their support and no longer can access them spaces. they are feeling more disconnected and lonely from their communities.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks very much. And we're going to come back to some of those isolation points towards the end of the session. Pat, Lindsay and Chanel, who's, I think I've just got to give a shout out to Chanel because you've been waiting for ages and I'm really sorry about that. So Pat, Lindsay and Chanel, and then we'll move on to the next topic, I think.
Hi, I'm Pat Armstrong, Chief Exec of Causal, which is the Association of Chief Officers of Scottish Voluntary Organisations. Now, hi John, I've not seen you for a while. So I suppose I'm probably coming with a comment which will cross all of your themes that you want to look at, because one of the things we've been working, so we work with third sector leaders, but we've been going through a project with Volunteer Scotland. And it's great to see Toby on the call as well, because what that's led to is almost system change, thinking about how we as a sector work differently, because we have been in Scotland, there was a Ready Scotland sign up, about 30,000 volunteers signed up. And as a sector, we were looking to how we placed those volunteers, but actually the work happened on the ground and mutual aid was the most successful. So people came together in their communities. And in some of the situations, it was actually better for the formal volunteering or the organisations to step out the way to enable that to happen. So what we've started, we've had a project in Scotland, partly using human learning systems, to look at how as a sector we have to change to incorporate and support that action with communities at the front line and what we have to do differently, but also look at how people engage and thinking about volunteering at all different levels, whether that's to go onto a board, whether that's to be a volunteer coordinator, but also the frontline level, because what we've been finding is people want to come together at the front line to do immediate support, and how as a sector can we work differently to almost not have vacancies that we try and fit volunteers in, but how we have opportunities that work around the volunteers and keep them at the centre. So I think there's almost a systematic change thinking that needs to happen to see how we support communities as we go forward. And I think that's one of the silver linings in the COVID cloud, is that we can actually think differently about how we work as a sector.
Thank you. That's really helpful, Pat. Lindsay and Chanel, and then I'm going to ask Carol to say a few words before she goes. I know we've only got you for a short time, Carol. So Pat, Lindsay, and then Carol.
Hi.
Sorry, Pat, Lindsay, Chanel, and then Carol. Apologies.
Hey, so I'm Lindsay Hall from Real Ideas. We're based in the southwest, and hi Lindsay, in Cornwall as well. We work a lot with young people, vulnerable young people, and also with social enterprises and community businesses. And I guess one of the things we have observed is that, as well as the definitely increase in volunteering, there's also been actually a real increase in terms of people's sense of community and belonging around the notions of community business, social enterprise. How do we support the sort of economic survival through all of this, which has been really interesting. And so, you know, spend local type campaigns, but also lots of really interesting collaborations between small entrepreneurs who are constantly opening and shutting things and trying to work out how they can come together in order to keep people going, support new entrepreneurial activities in a very community-based way. So I'm interested in, and I think it's to Pat's point really, is that feels like it's part of the way that we can actually begin to build more sustainable, different models which are fairer. And so how we sort of I suppose make sure that that sense of the whole community and all the aspects of both the economic impact of this as well as the social impact sort of come together. And then just the other point, which was, I think, back to Darren's point, which the digital issues have been huge. Obviously, digital inclusion, exclusion, that has created another whole community coming together to come up with some really interesting, you know, DIY solutions in places, which has been great. It's also meant that actually quite a lot of our experience is quite a lot of young people who were very isolated, you know, they've been in their bedrooms for years, actually saying, actually, we suddenly feel like we're experts. We know how to manage this. And it's been very interesting in the change in some of their confidence and ability to support others who are new to being stuck in their bedrooms. So I think some of that idea of, I guess, who's the expert and who isn't in communities is something that would be very interesting to explore, because, you know, we are unlocking people who potentially actually had experiences that were more negative beforehand. So it's not losing that as we move forward. And I really love the adaptation, not recovery phrase.
Thank you, Lindsay. Chanel, we're finally to you, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Please tell me if I haven't.
No, you're pronouncing it perfectly. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that's gone before. My name's Chanel, and I am the head of programs at Blueprint for All. Previously, we were named the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. Some of you might have been familiar with us under our previous name. At our charity, we actually work with underrepresented and marginalized communities that include people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And I stress communities, and it was quite interesting to hear Paul from LGBT Consortium kind of just say communities as a default, because within that umbrella identity term, there are, of course, lots of different communities included. It isn't just one kind of monolith. And I think the important thing is that we are seeing some of the inequalities that existed pre-COVID-19 being exacerbated. And I also kind of want to echo Sarah's query about just how representative the sample of this survey is. And with that representation, what kind of identity factors is it representative in, and which ones perhaps weren't the key focus? And it's okay if it wasn't everything, because people's identities are very complex. But I think it is important when the full findings are shared to be really open about which elements it is representative in, rather than saying it is representative, so that it doesn't end up further alienating people who might already feel not included or not represented in the findings. But actually, somebody in the chat, I can't remember who, so my apologies, put earlier that whilst it is kind of really positive and encouraging to see that 69% of people do feel part of the community, that still leaves nearly a third of people feeling like they're not. And that's quite a sizable minority. I think probably most people will agree. So there is kind of a lot of work to happen. And also, I just want to pick up on Jacob's point, and I think the way that you articulated it was really beautiful about bridging the gap. And I think with the kind of bridging element of bringing communities together, I think it's really important to, if we're kind of really picturing people on two separate banks or on two separate planes and there's a bridge between them, to really also take into account the power dynamics and the power inequality of both banks that the bridge separates, and to also kind of understand that the responsibility or the privilege of being able to move across that bridge sits more with the people who have the resources and the power and the privilege to kind of cross that bridge. It doesn't always sit equally on both. So it's not to infantilize or to reduce the power of the group that is underprivileged or underrepresented, but it's to be honest about the fact that for one side, it is easier because they have greater access to resources, or they're in the decision-making seat more often. And to come back to a point that I think Carol made earlier about the decision-making seat, with the communities that we work with at Blueprint for All, you know, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities are still awaiting fair and appropriate inclusion and representation. So not just as beneficiaries and of recipients of initiatives and funding, but also as the decision makers, and especially funding decision makers. So many are kind of having to make solutions for themselves without the access to the funding and the support and the kind of policies that will help them to do it as easily as groups who are overrepresented or overprivileged, or who have access to things. So I think it's really important that in those decision-making seats, there's representation, and that should include Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people, and also many other groups that are marginalized and underrepresented. And in that interim time, while it isn't the case, there are lots of groups that are popping up to support themselves. So within the Lewisham BME network that we run, we have a fantastic organization called KINARA, KINARAACIC. It's an infrastructure, it brings an organization that brings together different insights for communities who need funding, but there needs to be more funding available and decision makers that represent some of the groups that historically and currently are still underrepresented, and that's the work that we do at Blueprint for All.
That's wonderful, thank you. And thank you also for, so a few points there on the representation point. This is the first time we've done the CRI, so all of this is so helpful. And we did it at the back end of last year, as you might have noticed, John put that in the chat earlier in response to another question about when and how quickly things are changing. So I think this is a moment for us to reflect on it, but let's come back to, we'll be thinking about some of that as we go into the next wave, which I want to do at the same time next year. Thanks also for clearing up what Toby Lowe actually meant. I couldn't believe that Toby, you're known for being very clever, and you put a question in the chat about the third that weren't engaged, and Chanel's just helped me understand what you meant. So the third that of that percentage that didn't feel that they had contributed or felt part, and that's another area for us to explore. Apologies whilst chairing and looking at lots of different comments. I probably got that one wrong, but I can see where that comment was coming from, and that's again something for us to explore as we come back to it. Carol's leaving us soon and had her hand up. I'm also conscious there's other hands up. I think I saw Sado pop up as well. We've got another topic that's going to run on quite nicely from this one, which is about whether or not we think some of the positive benefits we've seen in terms of community spirit and community action will continue. Can we hold that in our heads and maybe let Carol have a final word before she's got to go, and then I'm going to come back to hands, and if I can ask you to think about that before I do. Carol.
Thanks, Faiza. I didn't have my hand up. It was an accident.
You did. So I apologise. I'm not doing very well at these hands today. I am going to give a blanket apology to anyone that I haven't got quite right. So don't feel you have to say anything, but I'm conscious you're going soon.
Yeah, I have to go at 10:30.
Yeah.
I wonder though, should Sado speak before me? I know she's had her hand up for ages.
They're never going to let me chair anything again at the fund. Go on, Sado.
Thank you, Carol. I think most of the points have really been picked up, and I'm not going to repeat around representation, voice, decision making. Yeah. I think just reflecting and maybe just picking up on the notion around communities, place-based and interest, and I guess reflection from our own experience right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think how that has really shaped how perhaps even the local authority responded. So what we found out around using geographic communities and completely living out BME communities, even in a city like Bristol, which I thought was highly inclusive. So that led to the creation, for example, for the fast food led within the community. So I think deeply holding that and understanding how communities organize and not just using the traditional methods that we use, because that became quite clear. Through when we had a crisis, we responded clearly through using traditional models that doesn't work for a lot of people, especially BME communities. So the role of WhatsApp, informal networks, role of mosques, churches, they were completely overlooked in terms of the overall framework of responding, and that was really a key lesson. And then moving forward around understanding also last year we had the pandemic, the disproportionate impact on BME communities, the notion of identity connectivity that becomes very, very clear, but also Black Lives Matter. Let's not forget that. Yeah. Really raised a whole discussion around identity, belonging, race equity. So really holding that and bring that, and what does that mean going forward? How do we build resilient communities in terms of understanding inequality, race inequity in those communities? Because what we found out is the complete lack of infrastructure, smaller organization, and the BME community with disproportionate impact. So there was a lot of expectation, and I think I feel proud how the community responded, losing people, living through mental health and all the issues. So deeply understanding the nuances within communities, but really, really being clear and intentional. If we go forward and face another crisis, how do we understand that and learn from that would be really key. And I will stop there.
Well, no, thank you. And thanks for waiting so patiently. We've got other topics in the agenda which are specifically designed also to pick up on particularly your last point on some of the more isolated communities or communities that weren't, I suppose, some of that bridging and bonding point about, how do we get to each other, as well as other things that we saw. So I'm keen that we do try and get through the topics. I think actually they're kind of interrelated and and seeing themselves through people's contributions. I'm going to come back to hands in a minute, but just reminding as of topic 2, which we're kind of into the time for now, and I think it continues the conversation, so I hope I'm not stopping people's train of thought. Very much about that common purpose we saw, and will that sense of community continue beyond COVID for you? So many of you have asked questions about those that are perhaps not part of our kind of lexicon of the people we're talking about. Are we missing particular individuals out? And if we are, what can communities, funders and government do to help support the community endeavour that we have seen? So we've seen a kind of surge of community spirit. Do you think it will continue? And what can funders, government, individuals do to support that? Again, very much in listening mode, want to hear from you. I'm going to go back to hands. It may be that you had a that wasn't quite related to that, but if I could maybe urge people to get onto that second part of the topic for discussion. Now, there are a couple of people who haven't come in yet, so I'm going to do a bit better chairing and try and bring those in first. So Catherine and Rocchio, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. If I'm not, please say when you speak. And then Alison and Jeff, and I'll come back to others after that.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Catherine Johnston, I'm the Chief Executive of Royal Voluntary Service. Thanks for inviting me, Faiza.
Thanks for being here.
So I wanted to come in on the positive benefits because we've, during the pandemic, been privileged enough to be able to mobilise just over 1 million volunteers. And that's given us both an army of workforce at the front line, but also a massive amount of data, because the majority of those volunteers have been very happy to share their experiences, what they think, where they're from, both culturally and in terms of their connectedness to their places and spaces. And because we have such large samples of rich information now about the way in which their journeys have happened during COVID over the last year, we've been able to match that to some of the ONS and other wellbeing scores. And one of the things that we'll be publishing, which I'd be really interested to talk to the Community Fund about, is that there is a definite causal relationship between volunteering and increased wellbeing. And that is proven without a doubt, and that is from all parts of the community, whether that be place, space or individual. So where people are able to bridge, to use Jacob Diggle's analogy, their ability to be able to use volunteering as a great leveller is something that is emerging from the pandemic, because not only was it an opportunity to step forward in your community, there was a desperate need for everybody to come together, and therefore that does appear to have broken down a lot of the barriers that we have all been struggling to cross historically. I guess one of the other findings that's been great from my perspective is that whilst we run national programmes, we do have a very big local footprint. So I would describe Royal Voluntary Service as one of those organisations that was fairly modest pre-COVID, had lots of community initiatives and lots of places across the UK where we operated with all of the local networks. But interestingly, going from being medium to large, where we literally are scaled up for COVID, we've asked some different questions. So we've said to people, if you're volunteering for a national scheme, does that mean you don't feel like a local volunteer? And the answer is definitely no. They are still connected and identify and feel that they belong to their local community. You know, they don't belong to Royal Voluntary Service. They belong to a community in their place and space, and where they don't belong to that physical space, they often belong to a physical cause. So feeding people, food banks, whatever. There also doesn't appear to be too much difference between whether or not that you formally volunteer or you informally. And actually we spend a lot of time as a sector sort of making judgments about where you are on being able to step forward and give your time, whether or not that's informally through a mutual aid or longer term through, say, a Samaritan's opportunity or a Mind Helpline opportunity or whatever. And actually people generally are saying that they're not really fussed about all of that. They just want to be able to access great volunteering opportunities in their local community. So I go back to the conversation earlier about systematic change, which our colleague in Scotland was talking about, because actually I think what COVID has demonstrated is giving us an opportunity, particularly around volunteering, to help people to access local community opportunities. We need to make sure the infrastructure is there in whatever form, and I think that needs to be mutually inclusive of local and national, because actually without the two, there is not enough infrastructure and will never be enough infrastructure. So I'm very happy to share our data sets. We've got about 750,000 volunteers contributing every few weeks to real-time evaluation, and the London School of Economics are about to publish the data sets around the responder scheme, which was only in England. But it's given us just some great opportunities to understand better how people from all walks of life, all communities, can use volunteering as that bridging and that connectedness to their local communities. The fact is that volunteering is very good for you, and that is proven with beyond a benefit of a doubt. I think volunteering is one of those recovery elements that we all need to take quite seriously, as how to help people to help themselves, to reset, build back better, recover and reset from COVID.
Thanks, Catherine. That's great. And one of the things for us to think about, for me in particular, is this is a data set, it's not, yes, we commissioned it, but actually its service is how we might align it to some of the other data sets that are out there. So it's great to hear about yours. Thank you. I've got is it Rockio? Have I pronounced that right or not? And if I haven't, please correct me. And then Alison and Jeff, and then I've got Naz and David as people we haven't heard from. And then I think we're probably into topic 3, which is looking at some of the issues that such as isolation and loneliness, which has come up, but I'll come back to topic 3 in a minute. So Rockio, then Alison, then Jeff, then Naz, then David.
Thank you, Faiza. It's Rocio.
I apologise. Thank you.
No problem. I'm Chief Exec of a charity which supports ethnic minority people in Wales. So many of the points have been covered in terms of the importance of more, having more diverse people in decision-making roles. So the importance of representation. I think the point made about the opportunities to build bridges, how that has been lost was really important. And obviously the physical, the increased physical isolation is really acutely impacts on minority ethnic communities, as does digital isolation and digital poverty. So those points have already been covered, so I won't repeat those. But one thing I wanted to raise is that I think that we need to kind of set the data in context. That I think that we kind of maybe we're on a slight crescendo of community spirit and feel good factor, and I think that potentially now is on a downward curve, and we might be getting beyond this honeymoon feel good period. I think we're going past that, and particularly the people that we engage with, ethnic minority communities, are feeling not so good. So many reasons. In terms of the direct health impact, many communities are actually feeling terrified of the threat from the virus, and when they constantly hear about their increased levels of vulnerability, death rates, losing people in their communities on a daily basis, they're feeling fairly terrified, many of them, and unprotected and abandoned. And given that so many of them working on the front line in caring roles, they're feeling pretty much let down by government and sometimes by the local communities. So that is a real a real strong feeling that, yes, at the beginning there was this idea that we were all in it together. We clapped for carers. People went, took the knee for Black Lives Matters. But when it actually comes to it, very little is changing. They're not seeing enough financial protection for people losing their jobs and losing their incomes. They're not seeing physical protection in terms of PPE in their roles. There's a kind of general retraction of obviously of the economy and the impact of the recession, and how that will impact on people's feelings of generosity, I think is a really important thing for the lottery to keep an eye on. And you know, we know already before this there was increasing levels of far-right attitudes and hostility to immigrants, and Brexit and all of that hasn't gone away. And I don't think that, you know, a severe economic recession is necessarily going to make that better. So, you know, the impact on rights of EU citizens in Britain, of asylum seekers, of refugees potentially, all of these rights are potentially being, you know, they are under threat. So just that the community cohesion story is not necessarily all rosy and as positive as maybe the survey suggests. And I am also concerned about that 3 out of 10. You know, what do they really think? You know, I think it just needs a bit of drilling down.
And it's helpful. I mean, and that whole the drilling down point is entirely the reason we didn't want to just do the survey, take from the independent surveyors who are expert and have done us a great, you know, service, but also wanted to hear this texture from you guys, and that will continue as we continue to share the findings in the report, which will be in early March. So there'll be moments where we can continue to hear. When we commission next year, some of this will really be very important, and I'm sure that there won't be kind of a blue sea between now and then. We'll be coming back to some of you. Rachel, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you.
I'll leave it there for now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think but it's really helpful that people are reinforcing each other's points as well, because it helps us get a bit of a trend of the conversation. Alison, Jeff, then Naz and David, who I don't think we've heard from just yet.
Hello. So I'm Alison Cowan. I'm the Exec Director of Fundraising and Engagement at Scope. And actually, hopefully what I'm going to say is just going to follow on nicely from what Rachel was saying. Scope is a pan-disability charity, so we campaign for the rights of Britain's 14 million disabled people, and we apply the social model of disability, so we focus on removing the barriers that disabled people face in society. And I think one of the, following on really from what Rosa and others have said, you know, for many disabled people, the pandemic has really exacerbated those feelings of isolation, loneliness and disconnection from society. And almost 2/3 of the people who died from coronavirus were disabled people. And that's a horrifying statistic. So one of the things I think we need to think about is, as we start to sort of emerge from this lockdown, hopefully soon, we need to make sure that all sections of society work together in some of the ways we're sort of touching on today, to make sure that that sort of isolation faced by disabled people is addressed rather than ignored. And there are some really positive stories about communities coming together and to support each other. Virtual communities for people at home have been really important. At Scope, we've got an online community of nearly 2 million members, and that's definitely become a place for people to speak to each other, to share sort of practical advice and tips on coping with lockdown, on mental health, on well-being, and it's creating new friendships, which is fabulous. But of course, we need to make sure that we get that balance between people that can be supported online and people that are supported offline. And go back to the point I made in the chat earlier about supporting community spirit in the long term. It needs to be driven absolutely by having inclusivity at its heart. And so there's something in practical terms about how do we get money to groups who are operating on tiny budgets in communities, to enable them to continue to operate and learn from the experiences that we've all gone through in the last year. How do we look at creating programs that are tailored to addressing the exclusion and promoting inclusion? And then I think there's also something about how do we invest in, at least in the short term, the organisations, communities that are operating online, how do we help them move offline to be able to support people who just don't have access to many of the things that we're taking for granted at the moment?
Thank you. And this is so helpful because, you know, we're mindful, the reason for this particular topic about will it continue, we're mindful that there is that sizable kind of minority in the findings. And also there's groups within groups, as we've discussed, and you can't have a one size fits all approach, and then there's overrepresentation in certain areas. It's about us getting clearer. If we're pleased to see some of that community spirit, what do we think if it might be the barriers to it continuing, or perhaps some of the really great things that are going on that we can encourage a bit more? I think I've got Jeff, then Naz, and then David.
Okay, hi, I'm Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
I'm head of policy for NICFA, which is the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action. We represent voluntary community organisations. I suppose the point's been made before, and I just really wanted to reinforce it about having the capacity to actually harness the community spirit and the importance of the infrastructure, and the fact that it has suffered very heavily. The organisations themselves have suffered very heavily. We've done 7 surveys of our members over the last sort of year, and some of the statistics coming back are that 40% of the organisations are saying that 70 to 100% of their volunteers can't volunteer, and a lot of organisations are their survival's threatened. So whilst there is an upsurge in I think desire to volunteer and to act in communities, the capacity to actually coordinate and harness that, is also potentially a casualty of COVID. And I think the other side of that is just in the question about what can government do. There's a tendency, I think, to think of our sector as great for emergencies, but it's trying to think longer term, that it's not just for emergency response, that how do you actually support the role of community organizations as part of the fabric of society, that acts as a way of capturing and channeling community activity. So I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is constantly trying to fight the battle to sort of make sure that people see that community activity doesn't always necessarily just happen. It needs to be supported, and the infrastructure there needs to be supported to do that. And how do we mainstream that as something which is as mainstream as the idea that we need business for the economy. So I think that's sort of something that we sort of thinking about longer term, building out of COVID.
Thank you, Jeff. Naz and David, and then Kunle. I'm glad you popped your hand up, because I think we've invited you to have a view on the last topic when we get to it. So Naz and David, and I haven't forgotten those of you that have got your hands up but have spoken before, but I'll be coming to you after others who haven't contributed just yet. So Naz, have we got you there? Thank you. Hi.
So I'm Naz, Lancashire BME Network. We're an infrastructure organisation supporting grassroots organisations across Lancashire, and it was really heartening to hear that 7 out of 10 people feel connected, but it didn't resonate with me because that's not our experience in Lancashire. So not going back over what's already been said, because I think others have said quite eloquently what I was thinking, which is that it depends on what you mean by connectedness, because what we've seen as an infrastructure organisation is our membership is more connected, but that's because of the efforts that we've put in to connect them, and they've come together through a common cause, which is to support their communities. But then when you look at connectedness within communities of interest and within place-based communities, that isn't there, because if you're looking at a community of interest, for example, a South Asian community living over a couple of streets, there's no connectedness there because they used to physically connect. And I can't see that situation improving, because the longer this goes on and the longer we have the pandemic and we're adapting, building back better is way ahead somewhere in the future, as far as I'm concerned. These communities are feeling more and more isolated because there is no physical connection. And what I'm finding from a personal perspective and speaking to our member organisations is that people are starting to focus more and more now on the internal rather than the external. And what I mean by that is, rather than looking after the communities, we're starting to look after our family units and our bubbles, because we're experiencing within our families that disconnect through mental well-being issues, physical well-being issues, isolation, digital exclusion, and we're concentrating more and more on looking after our own family bubbles. But there is also a disconnect at a system level, which I don't know if other people have experienced. But in Lancashire, we are way behind the curve in terms of connecting the systems up. So the health systems and structures don't speak to the local authorities. They in turn don't speak to the voluntary sector. And we as infrastructure are being relied on more and more and more, and being pushed to the extreme to support everything and connect everybody. And we physically can't do it. There is so much demand on us that we're struggling to connect and keep people connected, because we have to connect the organisations to the systems, and then the organisations we support have to connect to each other and connect to their communities. And what we're finding is that at the very micro grassroots level, that funding and that resource isn't getting there for those organisations to connect their communities, because they're so busy just doing. They're working at frontline, at crisis level, so busy doing that they're missing out on being connected. And our experience, and maybe it's just my experience because we are a Black and Asian and minority ethnic organisation, our experience seems to be quite different to other organisations and to other areas in the country. And maybe it's because we have been in the Premier League when it comes to disproportionate impact of COVID on communities, and especially our communities, our BME communities.
That's incredible input. Thank you, Naz. Thanks for sharing some of that. That's really insightful. David, and then Kunle, coming to you next. And I think we've also asked you to comment on the last topic as well.
Thank you, Faiz. To David, the Relationships Project. To your question about will it continue, I think we should, at the very least, assume that it gives us something to build on, and we should be positive about that. But I also think we need to keep reminding ourselves that those who've become much more involved in their communities over the last year aren't a single battalion waiting to be redeployed.
Yeah.
It amounts to 8-9 million individual moral choices, and I think we need to be thinking much more about not how do we redeploy, but how do we create an ecology that enables that upturn in community spirit to thrive. These people don't belong to government, and they don't really belong to the organisations around the table this morning either. The other thing that I was thinking about as we were speaking was that we've had a whole series of comments to the observatory along the lines of, I've been shopping by somebody who has told me that they don't want me to spend more than £10 a week. And I think that sort of comment suggests that people's eyes have been opened to the circumstances in which others in their community live at the moment. And I think if we could sustain some of those, what we've come to think about as undercurrents, those increases in understanding, those shifts in attitudes and opinions, that would be an enormous legacy from this period. How do we transition this conversation about relationships and shopping into a conversation about relationships and social justice? I think there is the opportunity to be doing that over the course of the next year if we're really careful about how we do that. Thank you. Again, another really incredible input. Thank you. And I've just been struck by the power of the inputs. I couldn't possibly respond to all of them, but it will be informing how we think about the work going forward, and some of these kind of areas for development. Yes, pleased to see some of the good findings that the report has shown, but actually really, really mindful of all the distance to travel and how different it can feel, as Naz said, for some of the communities, and she's not alone in expressing some of that. Kunle, we're over to you, and I know Sado and Darren have been waiting as well to come back in, and I haven't forgotten that. I'll be coming back to you. Oh, okay, if you have hands up, I've just seen Sado shake her head. If you have hands up that aren't real hands, legacy hands as they call them, please take them down. As you can see, I'm doing a shocking job of cheering as it is. So, Kunle, you've got your hand up. Comment on, if you could offer a few thoughts, and also we asked you to kind of open the floor for the last topic, so I'm just going to take the space to introduce that now. And invite you maybe to say a few words about that. And that was on the isolation and the loneliness point, but also saying, well, yes, that was an issue that came from our research, but are they, what other issues maybe have been pushed out and maybe haven't made the headlines? And in a way, I think people have been commenting on that as we've been going along. So we don't need to labour those again. There might be other things that haven't had a particular input, or you want to perhaps say a bit more about them. There's a moment to do that. So we were just conscious at the fund that certain things the media had picked up, but we want to hear from communities, obviously. So that's part of the reason to ask that question. But I've been so struck by how generous people have been in sharing some of what you're hearing and feeling in your worlds. Kunle, over to you. And Kunle MBE now, isn't it?
Well, something like that. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute. Voice for Change is a national infrastructure umbrella for the BAME sector, and a number of our colleagues and partners are on this call, and I think I'd like to reflect perhaps on some of the points that have been made. I mean, Naz in particular, I think touched on a few things that need to be, I think, shared again. But just in terms of the general point, in the first part of the conversation, there are lots of positive things that have developed in the course of the emergency, and certainly our relationship as a national body in engaging with organizations that perhaps we wouldn't have communicated more directly with more than maybe once or twice a year, to be in a situation where we're focused on those organizations and their communities every week and having some kind of dialogue on a much more regular basis. There is no doubt that it's brought us into a situation where we are closer to our regional partners. And their kind of feedback to us about looking at these things, I suppose, on a macro level, their experience of very much a London focus on a lot of the foundations and funders' efforts, and feeling that as regions, they are in some ways left out of the picture. So whilst we've kind of talked about through your survey what's happened at the micro level, at the macro level, there are distances also that we need to, I think, consider. And as such, Voice for Change, we are beginning to, through your help and other charities, bridge that gap that I think Kathy also referred to, in drawing people in closer, being more understanding of their particular situations. And I remember Naz's concerns in relation to the impact of the COVID numbers when they went up quite dramatically in the Northwest, and particularly in places like Oldham and Blackburn, and the kind of pressures that she suddenly found herself under that were not actually being picked up in the rest of the country. So for me, that's important. But I think, again, looking at the macro level, what happens in terms of overcoming isolation at the local level, there is a question about then how do we translate that into, as David was saying, leverage in terms of the bigger picture. And by that, I mean things like the civil society space, from parish councils right up to general elections. We have a vaccination program running at the moment, which has been heavily pushed by central government. There's a lot about deficiencies within BAME communities in terms of take-up, and we have a thing called vaccination champions. The interesting thing is that if you talk to many of the BAME leaders on this call, very few of them have actually been contacted by central government or by local government to engage in that campaign. So for me, despite all the rhetoric about how things have gelled more positively, there still seems to be a repeat of patterns that we've experienced in the past as BAME organisations. So then looking further ahead, of course, in May, we have mayoral elections coming up in metropolitan cities. Again, how does that question of need at the local level translate into those local elections? Is it that we refocus our efforts away from an emergency space now to a political space and forget what we've kind of found out about ourselves over the last, I suppose, year, and engage in that space in the same way as we've always done? I think that there is potential there to make new demands and to rethink how we also make those demands that we're only just beginning to kind of look at. And then I think just to finish, in terms of the broader questions of democracy and the issues of trust, I think the question of trust was something that was raised with us at Voice for Change by young people from Manchester, which is in terms of decision making and who you back in the civil society space, who do you trust? And I think that that's going to be one of the big issues arising out of this, from looking at everything from procurement to the question of simply how do we improve the knowledge and trust in the kind of research that's taken place to provide us with the answers that we're looking for. I'm hopeful that what you've done will give us some kind of insight into making improvements. There are many pieces of research that are going on, and what I don't have confidence in is that we are actually bringing all those different thinkers together and different ideas to formulate something that's cohesive, is going to actually improve our knowledge on the ground. I think at the moment it's still a little bit competitive, if I'm honest. You know, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, really helpful, Kunle, and thank you. And there's been such a lot of good, helpful, constructive points here today, not just in the things people have picked out and said, well, hey, you know, the research says this, but it doesn't say that. And that's really helpful because that's where we'll be thinking next. But what I don't want is to have this conversation and then go off and craft it with the independent researchers and not take advantage, frankly, of the perspective and the skill and the expertise here. And there'll be other people who are not here. And one of the things that somebody said was actually about joining up the different bits of research, Kunle, and you touched on it there, the kind of competitive space that might be emerging to be the kind of person, you know, who's got all the answers. And of course, none of us do. It would be nonsensical to say that we do. But I think there's something for us about how do we join up, and I'll talk to the team about whether or not there may be a point where we bring some of those research commissioners together, including us, to try and help open up some of that conversation. But also I'm thinking about, you know, really valuable inputs about should we be going deeper into some of the areas using, you know, we're a fund that can commission this stuff. So how can we use our platform and our power to maybe ask the right questions? It may be that we need to go deeper in some of the questions that, you know, you guys have posed today. So we'll be thinking about that and coming back at some point after this wave of research is out there. It's the first time we've done it. And I think, so certainly for me, one of the reasons we decided to do it in kind of my part of the fund was, you know, yes, we give out 14,000 grants a year. There's a lot also, by the way, that goes on, as you know, through the portfolios that commission that research. They have great grant management relationships. They talk to their grant holders. I'm not saying they're perfect, but there's a lot of listening going on. And how can we marry that with what people out there are saying? So really helpful points, particularly around the system points there, Kunle. Thank you. We've got, Kunle, did you want to come back on anything before I move on to Lindsay Brummett? I think you've got your hand up.
No, just apologies for having my camera off. I can't hear what people say otherwise.
Okay, no, it's lovely to see you, and thanks for that. Thanks for that input. Lindsay, over to you. I think you might have the last. Oh, your hands dropped down. That might be because perhaps. Oh, no hand. Yes, there you are again. I think you might be the last input actually, unless there's any others. And then I think I'm going to invite John, our CEO, to say a few words before we wrap up, and then we're fantastically, weirdly on time to close.
I will try and keep it that way then. So apologies for not interacting on chat. I can't see chat, so apologies. I would normally love to be tapping away, but just a couple of things I want to say, and I think it does link to what some of what Kunle was saying there around our experiences and maybe where funding and governments could think about opportunities going forward and sort of how we shift the space. So some of the research that we've done as the Big Lunch and Eden Communities over the years has kind of highlighted both that loneliness thing, and I do think you asked the question a little bit about is it on the rise or are we more aware of it? And I think both are true, and certainly the lack of the restrictions that we've seen will have affected people and how they're feeling. And in terms of how we move forward with that in society, you know, we're in a global pandemic, but our experience of that is local for all of us. So whether that's to do with restrictions or not, your experience of the pandemic will be your family, your friends, your street, etc. And I think when we think about where we concentrate our efforts going forward, there's a couple of things that came out of the survey we did recently about what are the most important conditions for effective response to things like this. The top two answers, above government, above funding and above resources, were having existing connections at a local level, which lots of people on here have already touched on, and also the skills and capacity of those people and community leaders to be able to work together. So as a really rich group of people here, there's some stuff I think we could do around how we work with government and with funding and so on to help with that and help do more of that bridging. But I think two things are really key. Having bumping spaces, that's changed. Our high streets have changed so much, and we're seeing so much more impacting our high streets at the moment, that those bumping spaces are no longer there where people make those informal connections. So having funding into spaces, whether those are outdoors or indoors, where communities can connect and come together informally as well as more organised, and funding events and things which foster connection, I think is a positive thing. And then I think that next step is how we help people to develop the skills and confidence of ordinary people. So not necessarily the people who already step up and do a lot in our communities, but those people who aren't quite sure and might have had an experience during COVID where they've stepped forward a little bit. How do we help them to build their skills and confidence to take those next steps and stay involved? And what are the mechanisms by which we do that? And a lot of that, just to sort of, I suppose, end on a slightly more positive note, is by encouraging things that are fun and are engaging for people. So almost not rebranding, but thinking about community not being a word that's synonymous with the negative things and the difficult things that our communities are experiencing, but with the joy and the hope that comes out of those communities and the response that they create. So I think there's a reframing of what community means for some people, and not always thinking about poverty and responses to the challenges that we face, but actually the joy that we see coming out of communities when they come together and do this stuff, because they all know how to react to the things that are happening on their own doorsteps, and they do that incredibly well. So how do we shine a light on that?
Thank you, Lindsay, and that's a really nice positive note to end on. And I haven't been able to read all the comments on the chat, but I'll be looking over them after this meeting. And just one, Kate Clifford, you put up about how does this enable us to be the decision makers at the table, which is a really nice question also to go away and be thinking about. John, are you still with us? I think it would be great to ask you to offer some final reflections before we close. I say that because I know John's diary is absolutely horrendous at the moment.
No, I'm still here, Faisal.
Thank you. If you could say a few reflections, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I have to say I've been listening and reading furiously, actually. So thank you all for your generosity.
That's the job of a CEO, isn't it?
So thank you for your generosity of input to this, and lovely to see and hear a few voices I haven't seen for a while as well. So I'm not going to claim that I can kind of represent everything that's been said and the richness, but I'm going to try and draw out a few points that leapt out to me, if you like. The first of those, I think, really helpful, some of the feedback about where we take this type of research next and some of the things we need to ensure. So the need for it to be representative came across really, really strongly. That's something for us to take away and think about. But also, I think something for us to take away and think about is how do we link this better to other people who are undertaking research, and linking it, of course, to some of our broader work, which Pfizer had talked about to start off with. So we will pick that up and take some of that away to think about how we improve this going forward, and perhaps draw out some of those nuances. I think really helpful points made about, we tend sometimes, there's a lot of talk about place, and place is really important, but also the relevance of communities of interest, particularly when I say that, I'm really referring to people who feel part of a community that might be physically dispersed, but share those share common interests or common attributes. So how important that is. It really stood out to me as well, the amount of you that talked about this difference between both bridging and bonding, and the need to think about how we ensure that we were concentrating on ensuring that communities are coming together and understanding each other, and so there's more of that interconnectivity as opposed to, I guess, just talking to who you know, to ensure that should contribute to greater cohesion. The topic of coordination came up, I think, when we were talking about the response, and whether and I think some differences of opinion in there about whether greater coordination is needed, or to some extent celebrating the way that communities self-organised as well. And I think there's a real lesson for us as funders to think about here as well. And I was drawn on what you had said, Sado, which was about how we need to think about how communities want to organise themselves and actually adapt to that, rather than thinking necessarily that communities should adapt to our traditional structures. And I think there's a really important thing for, particularly for us as funders, but all round to think about with that as well. Not losing sight of that, the importance of infrastructure and the role that infrastructure plays, both in supporting people to mobilise, but also supporting them to continue to mobilise in a way that's important to them. And David, you talked at the end about, quite rightly, about when people give their time, they don't belong to groups, they don't belong to government, they're doing it because they're passionate about the communities that they live in, and we need to try and seize on some of that. So that came across quite strongly. And I think the other piece, and it does go back to the representative piece, and we came back at the end, is, and I've heard this a number of times, so I'm going to pinch somebody else's analogy, in that, you know, during the pandemic, there'd been a lot of talk about we're all in it together. And people have said to me, yes, we might have been in the same storm, but we've been in very different boats, and how strongly that's come across. So the feedback from Naz about her experience in Lancashire was a real eye-opener, I think, with that. And then thinking more broadly about how civil society uses what we've seen and learned through the pandemic to start to actually flush out some of these issues at a more systemic discussion about understanding the situation that our neighbours find each other in aren't necessarily the same as us, and what that means for a broader discussion about social justice. So I'm sure I know I haven't covered everything that everyone said, but those were some sort of key reflections that I picked up through this. Just before I sort of sign off as such, a big thank you to you all. You've really given generously today in terms of those comments. You've given us some really big feedback, really good feedback to think about how we adapt what has been a first piece of work with this. I'd encourage you to have a look at our website, have a look at our insight section, where we've run some work called Voices from the Pandemic, which is capturing to some extent different perspectives. So this is part of a sort of broader piece. I also love the comment towards the end, the expression towards the end, bumping in space, and I hope this has provided you with some helpful bumping in space. It's really provided that for us, so really good to hear that as well. And finally, also a big thank you to you, Pfizer, for chairing this and chairing it really well. When you've got such a good topic to talk about, everyone wants to talk and has questions, and you've done a great job in terms of doing that. So big thank you. I've written quite a few points down here. I'll be using it when I'm talking to government politicians as well, because one of the things I try and do is feedback what I'm hearing from the front line. So thank you again for your time. Been really nice to meet you, and I'll just pass back to Pfizer to wind up, but thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's just so wonderful that you clearly paying lots of good attention there, because I know I didn't pick up all the chats either. But one of the things I want to reassure people is we'll be going away and taking quite a lot from this as our download and our kind of challenge back to us about how we do the next bit of research, and also what we do in the meantime, you know, who we join up with. So all that is just incredibly helpful, incredibly generous, and it makes us better. We can always be better. So team are probably going to come back to you at some point. There will be the findings, full report out early March. Continue to tweet about it if you wish, and do come back to us if there's things that come up after today, or even actually if you think, you know, I wouldn't mind sharing my voice on that series of insights that they talked about, or if you have questions about some of the things we mentioned. Really, really big thank you to everyone, and look forward to continuing being in touch with you. And
thank you.
I think. Bye.
Thanks.